So I'd just like to start by welcoming you all here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us in this virtual realm to have a great evening with Thor Hanson talking about bees and seeds. A few little Zoom etiquette things. While he's presenting, if you wouldn't mind muting yourselves, there's a little mute button in the bottom left-hand corner. And then when we're done with the presentation, we can have some conversation and some questions, and it'll be wonderful. And if you have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, there is a chat button on the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and open that up and type in any questions that you have or comments, and hopefully we can address those at the end of the presentation. Sorry, my cat's here. My name is Katie, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Heritage Trust, and I'm so excited to welcome you guys. We are the conservation organization here on the island to preserve and protect this beautiful place. And one of our newest programs is the Personal Preserve Program, which is all about inspiring people to adapt their own properties for habitat preservation, the changing climate, and just to make it beautiful. It's kind of focused on inspiring people to get out there and get projects done and be able to have a healthy habitat and to have thriving native plants and to conserve water. So if you're really interested in that, you can check it out on our website. But in the meanwhile, I am so excited to welcome Thor here tonight. He is an amazing author and biologist who grew up here in the Pacific Northwest, but has traveled all across the world to share his gifts. He has some amazing books such as Feathers and Seeds, and hopefully tonight we'll hear all about the magic of bees and seeds. So please join me in welcoming Thor Hanson.
Thank you, Katie, for that nice introduction, and thanks to everyone for tuning in, so to speak, this evening. I'm sure that we would all prefer to be in the same room, and I trust that those days will come again soon. But in the meanwhile, we can thank the Zoom gods for this virtual opportunity. And it's a pleasure, too, to be doing something for the Lummi Island Heritage Trust, having been a member for years and also done some events there, but actually stretching even farther back. I have to tell you that some of my earliest memories are of the beach over at Ligo Bay, where there used to be a marina or some sort of boat launch, where my family kept a boat for years, and we would launch there and scoot over to Orcas Island to the family cabin there. So a lot of early memories of catching the ferry over to Lummi en route to Orcas Island. So a pleasure to be with you all for many reasons. And I will be talking to you all about what I'm calling, for the sake of the Personal Preserve Program, backyard wonders, common backyard wonders this evening, which will draw on some of the research and writing that I have done about seeds and also about bees. And as Katie mentioned, I have also written about feathers, but I figured if we were going to include that this evening, we would be dangerously close to a lecture on the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. And I wanted to steer clear of that for our topic tonight. We don't want to be talking about 1960s pop songs all night. But if you do have a feather question, feel free to ask it during question and answer. I'm happy to talk about feathers then, but we're going to focus. We're going to stay focused on seeds and bees, good backyard topics. Now, as a biologist and an author, I have, of course, spent a lot of time thinking about plants and animals, but I also spend a lot of time thinking about people. A surprising amount, really, because my goal and my hope in this work is not simply to talk about nature, but to help people connect with it or reconnect with it, as you will. And so to that end, I'm particularly fascinated by natural objects that transcend the imaginary but very significant boundary that we tend to erect between the natural world and the human world, right? We never stop to think about the the poppy seeds in a piece of cake, or the down feathers inside of our pillow, or the buzzing noise you hear from the shrubbery beside your front door. But when we do take time to pause and investigate these common wonders, we find that they can be touchstones to nature, connecting us to wonderful stories about biology and evolution, the natural world, and how we are connected to it every day, wherever we happen to live. And what I want to do for you this evening is just delve into a few stories that I think really exemplify that daily connection that we have with nature. So as we get started now, I have to ask for your patience, but I may be sharing a good Zoom trick with you here. I'm going to perform the Zoom miracle of sharing my screen, but I'm going to share just a portion of the screen. This is a trick. If you ever find yourself giving a Zoom talk, that I learned from my sister-in-law, who is a school teacher and Zooms all day long. And she said, if you have a less than stellar internet connection, which we do here in rural San Juan Island. I don't know about over there on Lummi how your internet is, but here on San Juan, it's a little feeble. So I'm going to share just a portion of my screen. And you do that by hitting portion of screen, share, and then a little bit of adjustment. And there we go. Hopefully that is going to work. Yes. Okay. So now you should be seeing, I hope, a slide with a bee and some fine looking seeds on it. The first story that I want to dive right into, it does have to do with seeds. And when I first started working on seeds and writing a book about them, my wife made an interesting observation. She said, you know, your first book was on mountain gorillas. And then I'd written about feathers and I was moving on to seeds. And she said, you know, your topics keep getting smaller. What's next? You know, dust motes? I mean, we're just working down in size here. And it's fair enough. It's a good observation. But I have learned that the size of one of these common backyard wonders really has no bearing upon its importance or upon the important stories that it can tell us. So just consider, if you will, one of the most basic characteristics of seeds, and that is endurance. The way they are built to lie dormant in the soil for months, for years, or even decades before sprouting. We take it for granted that a packet of seeds can be stored through the winter and planted in the spring, or that staple grains like wheat and rice and corn can sit around for long periods of time in silos and warehouses and even in our own pantries and still be fresh. Our farming systems, our food systems truly depend on dormancy, this great long-term storage capacity of seeds. But it really is a trait that remains quite mysterious. How does a baby plant enter what amounts to a state of suspended animation for months or years and then spring to life again when the time is right? It's truly a remarkable thing biologically, as well as for the gardeners amongst us. Now, experts aren't sure exactly how this works, but they think it has to do with something called bioglass. We know that truly dormant seeds are desiccated. They lose 75, 85, even 95% of their water. And what's left inside those shriveled cells, the nucleus, the various organelles that make a cell function, somehow in that state become encased in this sugary substance that's very glass-like. That's a bioglass. And in that state, they manage to preserve not only their function, but a sense of arrangement, a sense of form, so that when the seed is flooded with water again at germination, a process that goes by the wonderful term of imbibing, when the seed imbibes and takes on all of that water, all of those organelles in the cells rearrange themselves right back to how they were before they desiccated, and they start functioning again. Now, animal cells, by and large, certainly human cells, cannot do this. So don't try this at home. If you desiccate your cells, they won't work afterwards. But seeds know that trick very well, and it is crucial to their biology. So even though scientists haven't quite figured out how this works, we are already borrowing that same technique for all sorts of interesting applications, including the development of vaccines that can work now in places far from refrigeration. We all think a lot about vaccines these days, and if you read the news, one of the challenges with the coronavirus vaccine, or many of them, is they need to be frozen, they need to be refrigerated, right? This has been a sticking point for vaccinations of all kinds around the world. How do you get vaccines out to places that don't have electricity and refrigeration? Well, by borrowing an idea, if you will, from seeds, bioglass, we can now do it at least for a measles vaccine. It's the first dry vaccine. And they take a live measles vaccine, they suspend it in something called myo-inositol, which is a form of sugar extracted from where? Inside various legumes, inside rice. It is a bioglass taken from within seeds. And now it enables those vaccines to be stored just like a packet of seeds for months at a time, reaching all of these places that previously were outside of the realm of vaccination. But of course, as any gardener knows, seeds can last a lot longer than a few months. Sometimes you have some tomato seeds that have been lying around for years before you put them in the ground, and you'll still get some germination, which invites an obvious question: how long can a dormant seed last? How long can they survive? And the answer to that question is really an incredible story that comes to us from a place called Masada. And on the off chance that you missed the Peter O'Toole miniseries in the mid-1980s, Masada happens to be a rocky fortress on the edge of the Dead Sea. Way at the top of that rocky spire is this wonderful fortress. And it is a significant place because it was the site of a famous siege during the Great Revolt, when a band of Jewish rebels held out on top of that crag against a full Roman legion for months on end. And to breach the walls, finally the Romans built a causeway, or almost a ramp out of dirt, all the way up the side of the hill, and finally got through the walls. And when they did so, they were met with silence. They were met with silence because the vast majority of the rebels had committed mass suicide rather than surrender to their enemies, the Romans. So this very important place in Jewish history, very important place now in modern day Israel. And it has been fully excavated. Parts of it have been restored. There's been archaeology going on there since the 1960s. And during that dig, they found all sorts of things. They found weapons, they found coins, they found storehouses that had been filled with food when this thing collapsed. And it was so well preserved. There were shards of pottery with the remains of olive oil still inside. There were stores of grains, and they also found a huge trove of dates that were so well preserved that there were still bits of flesh clinging to the pits of those dates. That dry desert air did a wonderful job of preserving these things. And this was significant because these weren't just any dates, they were Judean dates. And Judean dates were the cash crop of King Herod's kingdom, and they were famous throughout the ancient world. They are mentioned in the Bible, they are mentioned in the Quran, they are mentioned Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, demanded Judean dates, and only Judean dates, on his breakfast table every morning. So they were a famous variety, but they disappeared. After the fall of Judea, those dates disappeared. People stopped growing them in that area, and that variety was lost to all time. So finding these things was really significant. And so being good archaeologists, they wrote numbers on all these little date pits, and then they put them in a drawer someplace in Tel Aviv. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago that some botanists heard about this and got their hands on a few of these date pits, and they planted them. And lo and behold, if one of those pits didn't sprout and grow into a full, healthy Judean date palm after 2,000 years buried in the rubble at Masada. 2,000 years buried there in that dry, dark place. And now Methuselah is even bigger than this. This is now an outdated tree. So this picture, they give it its own little private compound in a kibbutz in southern Israel. They pamper this tree, and they are madly now trying to sprout more. They've been doing this for years and years because Methuselah turned out to be a male. The sexes are separate in date palms. And so this tree could produce pollen, but it was not possible to actually recreate the date itself until they found a female. And finally, after 10 years of work, this past year, they had several females that were able to sprout from similarly ancient dates. And this is what you're witnessing here is the first harvest of the Judean date in nearly 2 millennia. Truly a remarkable feat of biology. And luckily, I talked to one of the researchers about this, and she was extremely relieved that the dates were indeed very delicious, because she said we all would have felt like fools if this was a crummy date and we spent 10 years trying to bring it back. So it's a wonderful symbol, really, of endurance, a symbol of mystery, and it's hardly the only ancient seed out there. The director of our national seed bank, Chris Walters, which she's down in Fort Collins, Colorado, and she knows more about dormant seeds than perhaps anyone. She told me something truly remarkable. She told me this, and I will quote it to you. She said that a dormant seed has no measurable metabolic activity. She's been studying this. You put a dormant seed, a truly dormant seed, into a chamber and you measure everything that's happening around it, and nothing is happening. No metabolic activity. And when she told me that, I said, you know, in biology, we have a name for things with no metabolism. We call them dead. And then she looked at me and she said, well, she said, if we know of things that are metabolizing, that are living, sorry, we know of things that are living but aren't metabolizing, she said, then maybe we need to change our definition of what it means to be alive, which is a fascinating thought. Something as common and simple seeming everyday item as a seed can challenge our very notion of what it means to be alive. So I could rattle off all sorts of additional facts about these wonderful seeds that are everywhere in our backyards, in our personal preserves, but even in our kitchens. They surround us all day long. But I believe that George Bernard Shaw captured the whole story very well in 1918 when he said this: think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay. Now, bees are another essential backyard wonder, and they have been on my mind for a long time too, in part because of a story that I heard years ago, one that I think says not just a lot about bees, but a lot about the human relationship to nature in the first place. Now, this traces back to the mid-1990s when I was working on a mountain gorilla project, in a place called Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in southwestern Uganda. And since then, I have learned that people will actually get mad at me if I don't include at least one photograph of a baby gorilla in every presentation that I make. And so this is tonight's baby gorilla. So the job of tracking these gorillas involved a lot of hiking through the rainforest there. And the weather was hot, of course, and we were often beset upon by these hordes of tiny little black flies. At least I thought they were flies until I bothered to look closely and realized that they were tiny stingless bees, marvelous little creatures, tiny stingless bees, totally harmless, no bigger than a pencil point, and they were attracted to the salt and other minerals in the sweat on our skin, right? And the forest held at least a dozen species of these gentle creatures. Well, A Ugandan graduate student from Makerere University in Kampala came down to study them. This was his master's thesis. He was going to study these little things, and he had been there for over a week. When he came to us at the park office, he was tearing his hair out because he couldn't find the nests of any stingless bees. He'd been hiking through the forest, he'd been looking everywhere, he could not find where they were nesting. And one of the guides or trackers that I worked with suggested that he go and talk to the Batwa, which is a tribe that until very recently had been living within the forest, calling it home, and knew it better than anyone. So Vincent took that advice and he hired a local Batwa man. They went into the rainforest. He said the Batwa, he was telling me about this later. He said, we walked straight to this clearing and we sat down next to a flower and we waited in the hot sun. He said, we just sat there waiting and waiting. And then finally, a stingless bee came and landed on a flower, futzed around for a while, as bees will do on a flower, and then left back into the forest. And it happened again. And they waited. And this happened over and over again. And Vincent he was starting to think, what am I paying this man for? We're just sitting here. When finally, after this had happened many times, the Batwa said, we go. He stood up. They walked straight into the forest for a few minutes, just parting through the branches, going on a straight line into the forest. After a while, the guy slowed down. He started looking around. And within a minute or two, he pointed to a rotten stump, and there were the bees going in and out of a hole in the stump. Tracking bees in the rainforest. This has always been, to me, one of the goals of any naturalist. You should be able to track a bee. I don't think I'll ever make it there, but for this man who knew that forest so well, there was nothing to it, right? Because he knew the type of flower that this bee was going to land upon. So he knew where to sit and watch. And he watched the direction that the bee was flying, or many bees, back and forth. So he knew what direction the nest was in. And he was sitting there long enough to watch them make a round trip. So he knew how long it took for the bee to fly to the nest and back. And since everybody knows how fast bees fly, that gave him an estimation of the distance. So all he had to do was stand up after a bit of observation, walk a bee line, if you will, through the forest. And he knew that that species nested in stumps or rotten logs. So once he was in the right place, he just looked around for the stump and there they were. It was obvious to him. It was obvious to him. And I think that is a wonderful story, not only for bees, but because it says so much about us and our history. There is a lot more tracking in our history as a species than there is texting, right? This is something natural to us. So I truly believe that learning about nature is, in a sense, not just an exploration, but an act of remembrance. We are born to do this stuff. And remembering bees now is particularly important because we've all seen the headlines about honeybee colonies collapsing in mass and the widespread declines of many other kinds of bees, bumblebees, and so on. But in reading those stories, I've often noticed a certain, mushiness about the subject matter. I mean, what do we really know about bees? Even the experts often stumble over the details. I was once driving along in my car here on San Juan Island on the west side. I don't know if you've driven down the west side of San Juan Island, but there's a steep cliff on one edge there. And I was driving along, listening to the radio, and they were interviewing a very noted historian of science who said that when the settlers arrived at Plymouth and Jamestown, they brought honeybees with them from Europe, which is true. The honeybee is a European and African species. So that part was true. But then he went on to say that if they hadn't, there would have been nothing here to pollinate their crops. At which point I almost drove into Harrow Strait. I couldn't believe it. What about the 4,000 species of native bees already buzzing happily around North America? Couldn't believe it. But that's not the worst of it. Given my interest, it probably won't surprise you to learn that I keep a copy of the book Bees of the World on the shelf in my office. And it is a fine reference book written by two good entomologists. It's nice hardback edition. It's published by a good nonfiction press. And the cover features a lovely close-up photograph of a fly. A fly on the cover of Bees of the World. I mean, what have we come to? So here in the 21st century, we are in a peculiar position. We are in the position of knowing more about the plight of bees than we do about the bees themselves, which means I think that the proper place to start in any exploration of bees is right with the most basic question of all, which really is, what is a bee? What is a bee? And happily, I have an answer to that question that I think is memorable, it's short, and it really does sum up all of the key steps of bee evolution. So I want you to all remember after this lecture this evening that a bee is a hippie wasp. A bee is a hippie wasp. Let me explain this for a minute. The first thing to remember is that wasps came first, and the bees evolved from the wasps, and they still look quite a lot like them, which is why the two groups are so often confused. But if you find yourselves being harassed at a picnic, like these poor souls here, and you notice that your attackers are clustered over the roast beef, or they're at the fried chicken, or they are stealing bits of bologna from the sandwiches, then don't blame bees. Your attackers in that case are certainly wasps, because wasps are carnivorous. They are carnivores. They're constantly out searching the landscape for bits of flesh or for insects that they can hunt, for spiders, other bits of protein that they can subdue and take back home to their nests to feed to their offspring. It's a very successful lifestyle for the wasps. They've been doing this for millions of years before the bees came along. The bees evolved from the wasps by making an important change in their diet. They learned to provision themselves and their offspring solely from the products of flowers. So it was that dietary shift that set them on their own evolutionary pathway. And once they started that new diet, their bodies began to adapt to it, including the evolution of long tube-like tongues for sipping nectar from deep flowers, including the evolution of branched hairs that are specifically adapted for carrying more pollen from a flower back home to the nest. All of this happening then as a result of that change in diet. Oh, so let me switch back up to that. Yeah, so, and you can see the branches. In fact, that's why I included that picture. This is an electron microscope image. You can see the grains of pollen and how they just stick to those finely branched hairs, which are a bit feather-like, which is probably one of the reasons I really love this picture. We've got bee hairs looking like feathers, and my whole career is coming together. So at any rate, there is nuance to the story. There are some bees that are parasites on other bees, and they don't bother collecting pollen, so their bodies are smooth and wasp-like. There are even wasps that enjoy sipping nectar now and then. But if you want to remember the basics of bee evolution, you just have to remember that they are the hippie wasps. They are the flower-loving, vegetarian, long-haired wasps. They're the hippies of the whole wasp clan. And that will tell you in an instant the story of bee evolution. Now, all of this happened quite a long time ago, and that brings us to our dinosaur slide. This evolutionary activity took place in the middle of the Cretaceous period, which was a time on this planet dominated by the dinosaurs, famous dinosaurs. But if you can look past those lumbering beasts for a minute at the vegetation, you see something quite interesting. There are conifers in the canopy, there are ferns abounding, but where are the flowers? It's not exactly a promising place for the evolution of an insect that's going to rely solely upon the products of flowers. You have to look pretty hard in this picture to find a couple of shrubs that maybe could produce a flower or two. So this was really quite a bold move. when it happened. And in fact, quite a dramatic one and quite a mysterious one, in that throughout the Cretaceous period, you had virtually no flowering plants. And then all of a sudden, you can see it in the fossil record, there are flowering plants everywhere. Charles Darwin considered it what he called an abominable mystery, one of the greatest threats to his theory and idea about evolution as a slow and incremental process, because Darwin was very familiar with fossils and he couldn't explain this. Where did all these flowering plants come from so suddenly? But in the same letter, it was a correspondence with a friend of his, a botanist named Hooker, where he made that abominable mystery comment and showed his real concern about this puzzle. He also mentioned his correspondence with a lesser known naturalist of the day, a Frenchman named Gaston de Saporta, who had written to Darwin with his theory that in fact the flowering plants had evolved rapidly. They had appeared on the scene in a rush because of their interactions with flower visiting insects, particularly the bees. And Saporta believed that that had spurred a huge rush of evolutionary activity. Well, Darwin didn't buy it. He didn't buy it for a minute. He preferred to believe that the flowering plants must have evolved slowly and incrementally somewhere else. And just these places where they became fossilized. Well, Darwin was the more famous naturalist of the day. He also, as you can see, he had a bigger beard. And I think that counted for a lot in the Victorian era. So everyone believed Darwin then for decades. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century when pollination studies became more advanced that people began to realize that Saporta had been right all along, and that it was this interaction between flowering plants and insects, particularly bees, that drove the rapid evolution of flowering plants. And you can see the results now anywhere in your backyard preserves there on Lummi Island. You can see them in a mountain meadow. You can see them at the nearest flower market. But what is less well known is how that great diversity of flowering plants, which now dominate our flora, 95% of the plants in the world are flower-bearing plants. Total flip-flop from the Cretaceous, where the flowers were bit players. Now they dominate the planet. But what's less well known is how that great diversity drove in turn an incredible diversity of bees. An incredible diversity which ranged from the familiar, like this honeybee, to the fantastic, like this iridescent sweat bee, which is one, in fact, that you can see in your backyard there on Lummi Island. To the downright strange, this one you cannot see. This one occurs only in the Atacama Desert of Chile. This long-tongued specimen, the tongue twice the length of the body, a remarkable bee newly discovered in Chile. They can be minuscule, like this tiny golden bee, so small that it had to be stuck to the side of the pin. You can't even get a pin through it, it's so tiny. Or they can be massive, like this wonderful oil collecting bee from Puerto Rico, or even larger, Wallace's giant leafcutter bee from Indonesia, big enough to spread across the palm of your hand. They can be colored rather simply, like this one with a bit of orange, a leafcutter, or they can be fantastic with red fuzz over the top of the thorax. They can even be banded with blue. There are even bees in the world that have stripes that scatter light just like the surface of an opal, so that when you look at the bee, you see rainbows of color. Truly remarkable. And here's a phenomenal purple bee from French Guiana. And it's true that many bees are fuzzy, like this longhorn specimen, but they can also be smooth, like this blood bee. And this one, which is an orchid bee, a euglossine bee, smooth, dimpled surface, iridescent green, this one from Central America. And it's true that some bees are alarming, or at least certain parts of them are alarming to us. But it is also true that in spite of their faceted eyes and their waving antennae, bees can be what can only be described as cute. A little hairy-eyed bee from Argentina. So the coevolution of flowering plants has led to great diversity on both sides of the equation. A full 20,000 species of bees can be found buzzing around this planet, which is more than all the birds, all the mammals. You could even throw in the reptiles, all of that put together, less diversity than the bees. A truly remarkable group. And only a tiny fraction of them have ever been studied, which means that there on Lummi Island, here on San Juan Island, it is entirely possible that we could be within a few miles of a bee unknown to science, which is quite thrilling, I think. So now, if I were giving this presentation 100 years ago, if I was giving it 50 years ago, I would stop now and take your questions. But really, in this day and age, we can't talk about bees or seeds or other backyard natural wonders without confronting some of the problems that they face. We've heard about the colony collapse disorder and the declines in bees. We have heard about habitat loss and loss of crop diversity as a challenge to the plants. But now even some of the relationships that hold bees and plants together are threatened. And I bring to your attention this local situation here, which is a wildflower that you may have seen there on Lummi called death camas, which is a beautiful member of the local flora, blooms in springtime, and is so named the death camas because it is toxic. The leaves are toxic, the seeds are toxic, the roots are toxic, but oddly, for a flowering plant, even the pollen and the nectar are toxic, which is a pretty crummy way to advertise if you're trying to draw in pollinators. And it would not work at all if it hadn't been for the appropriately named death camas bee, which you see here, which is the only bee in our flora or our fauna that has figured out how to detoxify the poisons in the death camas, which means that the two species now have this wonderful paired relationship. The flower has a dedicated pollinator that hardly visits anything else, and the bee has its own source of pollen and nectar. But now what we're seeing is the potential for what biologists call a timing mismatch, starting to separate these tightly bonded species in time, in that the death camas in the San Juan Islands is now blooming 2 weeks earlier than it used to because our spring times are getting warmer with climate change. Whereas the bee that nests underground, a place that's warming more slowly, appears to still be on the old schedule. And so that critical period of time where these two species that depend upon one another exclusively or close to exclusively, that period of time is growing shorter and shorter. And it's unclear whether they will continue to overlap long enough to keep the bees healthy and to keep the plants pollinated. So there are now these threats, not just to individual species, not just to individual plants or bees, but even to the relationships that keep these things together and have led to this wonderful evolution in the first place. So the threats are real, they are daunting, but I believe that makes it all the more crucial for people to do what you all are doing with your personal preserves, to reconnect to nature. In that I truly believe that our resolve will gain strength through wonder, if you will, through interaction with the natural world. We are stronger when we can meet these challenges that we face now, not from a standpoint of despair, but from one of fascination. So I want to conclude then the presentation before we get to question and answers with a short passage that is from the beginning of the book that I wrote about bees. And I'd like to end at the start because truly we are just at the beginning of understanding many of these wonderful backyard creatures and plants. And we're certainly still at the beginning of doing what we can to help them. So this begins with a quotation as well. And this time it is from Henry David Thoreau, who wrote, "There are certain pursuits which, if not wholly poetic and true, do at least suggest a nobler and finer relationship to nature than the one we know. The keeping of bees, for instance, is like directing the sunbeams. Bees today certainly need our help, but just as importantly, they need our curiosity. Exploring the history and biology of these essential creatures can transform anyone into an enthusiast, and that is the purpose of the book. But I hope that you will do more than read it. I hope it makes you want to go straight outside on the next sunny day, find a bee on a flower, and settle down to watch. If you do, you might just find yourself daring to reach out and catch that bee, the same way that my young son has done since the age of 3, barehanded. Try this, and you too can feel the tickle of tiny feet and the whispery rustle of wings on your palm before you slowly part your fingers, hold the bee up, and set it free. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to any questions that you all might have. And if you have sent any via the chat, I think, Katie, I'm going to ask you to manage that for me, because I will get totally befuddled if I'm opening multiple windows here.
Certainly, yeah. So there is one question that just came through on the chat. If you don't mind, I'm just going to start off with that one. It says, our plums flower in early March, just when our mason bees wake up, but they didn't pollinate a single one last year. Is there a way to make the plum flowers more appetizing to the mason bees?
That's a really great question. The plums are in our neck of the woods that the hardest fruit tree to get a good bout of pollination on, because they bloom so early. Many of them bloom so early, and it is just when there are a few bees starting to come out. So the mason bees will visit plum flowers, but what you're seeing first with those masons that come out is mostly male bees. The males emerge first from the mason bee colonies, and mostly what they do in those first weeks is wait around right at the colony, waiting for the females to come out so that they have a chance to mate. And so even though you may see some activity around your mason bee blocks at the same time that your early plums are blooming, oftentimes there's not a lot of pollination going on until a little bit later in the mason bee life cycle, when the males, those layabouts, have already fulfilled their purpose and pretty much gone by the wayside. It is the females in the mason bee clan, and really the females in all bees, that do the vast bulk of the pollinating. Because for mason bees, it's the females that are collecting pollen, so spending more time on flowers. A male might visit a flower to sip some nectar, like having a drink of soda pop at the hookup bar. Might be there looking for females and so forth. But it's the females that are really doing the pollinating. They're in there messing around, gathering pollen, getting it all over themselves to take back to the nest. Because in the bee world, the nectar is mostly consumed by adults, sugary fuel for flying around and doing adult things. And it is the protein-rich pollen that is fed to the larvae as they're growing. They need that protein to grow. And so it's sometimes mixed with a bit of nectar, this sort of thing, but it's mostly protein to the kids and nectar to the adults.
There was a follow-up to that one, and it just said, can I use a paintbrush since there aren't other pollinators around, I think, to help pollinate that?
Oh yeah, no, great question. Yeah, so hand pollination is a fascinating process. I encourage you to try it anyhow. Yeah, get out there with a paintbrush. You can use a tuft of hair from your dog's tail, or borrow a dog if you don't have one. That works really well. And what you're trying to do is mix, it varies by the tree. So do a little bit of research before you go out there. Some trees and some species need to be, among trees. Sometimes it's within a tree, but yeah, definitely you can move pollen from the male parts of the flower, the stamens and so forth, and get it onto the stigma, the female part, and you can in effect some hand pollination yourself. And when you do that, what you're going to suddenly realize, among other things, is how valuable the work is that bees do for free. Because it is incredibly time consuming to pollinate an entire fruit tree. And yet that is something that is occurring in certain places in the world where bee populations have completely crashed. There's a famous apple growing region in China, where due to a variety of factors, habitat factors, but also it's thought a lot of pesticide use, there was a great crash in the bee population, and they had to hand pollinate that whole apple crop for years. And it added a lot of costs to the whole effort. I mean, and finally people began simply replacing the apple trees with other things because it wasn't cost effective. There are very few hand pollinated commercial crops in the world, and they are the most expensive things in the produce aisle in the grocery store, or some of the most expensive. One of the few is, well, this takes us back to the Masada story, but date palms are hand pollinated. So the date palm will do a bit of wind pollination. Bees don't really like it, but by and large, to get a commercially viable crop, you need to hand pollinate those trees. And so every date palm tree, they're climbing up and down that tree multiple times a year, or now they tend to use these cranes to get up there in a lot of the orchards here in the States. But that's been going on for literally thousands of years, hand pollinating those dates. And dates are really expensive, and that pollination cost is a part of that expense. And the most expensive, probably on a per pound basis, fruit, if you will, in the grocery store, you can't even get in the produce aisle. You have to go over to the spice aisle, and that would be the vanilla bean. And the vanilla bean is a fruit from an orchid that is native to Mexico mostly. And Mexico had the absolute corner on the market for centuries because the only bee that really pollinates that orchid is native to Mexico. And you couldn't do this, you couldn't grow it anywhere else. You'd never get anything viable until finally someone figured out how to hand pollinate it. And then suddenly Mexico lost that market, because then you could grow this orchid any place tropical, and as soon as the trick of hand pollination for that crop. But that's why, on a per pound basis, it's absolutely astronomically expensive, in part because of all that hand pollination. Lots of effort. And the bees do that sort of stuff for us all the time for free.
Thanks. Does anyone have any other questions? Well, I've got one. You showed some pictures of all these wonderful bees that were all different colors. Why? What is the advantage to the different colorations in them?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, so the colors for a lot of insects of that ilk, if you will, are signals, signaling to other creatures. They're often bright, often brightly colored, signaling that this is something dangerous, if you will. So there's been a lot of evolution to come up with these bright banded patterns that you see repeated again and again throughout that whole group, that tend to go along very well with the more dangerous species, something that's going to sting, right? So there's it's communicating outward to potential predators of the bees, which include, a range of things from birds to bears and other hungry creatures. And then for some species, there can be some within species communication as well. You sometimes see differences in the coloration between males and females that signal communication for breeding opportunities and that sort of thing. The males in all bees have significantly larger eyes than the females. They are absolutely programmed to detect motion, because anything moving by might be a female. And so you can imagine that with that evolutionary impetus of potential breeding, motion, but also for some of them, color is a part of that patterning as well. So there are several reasons then why you see bright colors in a lot of those species. Although there are also many, many bees that are simple black little insects, and most of them are pretty harmless.
Nice. We got a few more questions coming through in the chat. So this one says, we arrived back in the SF area in early October. The Mexican sage was in full bloom. Not only did the bees find it attractive, so did the hummingbirds and the bumblebees. Are they all going after the same thing?
Yes. Yes, they are. It's so what you're seeing there is a marvelous situation of a rich, in that case, nectar source. I don't know if it's also a good pollen source for the bees or not, because I don't know the species well enough, but a very rich nectar source. And so it's attracting all of those creatures, certainly for nectar. The bees may also be getting pollen, and I don't know in that particular case. But you tend to see great concentrations of honeybees on certain patches of good flowers because they communicate so well with one another back at the hive, right? This is, if you've ever heard of the waggle dance and so forth that bees use to communicate, that is a honeybee tendency. And honeybees are a highly social bee where you get 10,000, 20,000, 40,000, even 50,000 or more individuals in the same colony. And when a good patch of flowers is discovered, the scouts that find it communicate their discovery to the rest of the hive by certain motions, smells, and other things. And in a sense, they're sometimes competing. Like the patch I found is better than the patch you found. At any rate, they try to get more of their sisters. It's again the females doing the collecting for the hive and to follow them. And so you end up with huge numbers if there's a good patch like that and there's a hive nearby, or even within a mile or so, they'll fly that far to a good patch. So if you've got nectar, you're bound to get them if they're around. Bumblebees are also a highly social bee. They live in much smaller colonies, maybe 20, 40, 200, 300 or more for a few species, so much smaller, but they have great memories for flower patches. They harvest a little more individualistically than the honeybees. But then you have the hummingbirds that are also nectar feeders. So if you've got a good patch like that, you're going to have hummingbirds on it as well. So you really do see some great diversity and also some competition for that resource. Keep your eyes on those flowers, and you're bound to see some fighting going on, if you will, struggling for that resource. A fascinating study done on the pollination of sunflowers in commercial orchards where they're growing the sunflowers for seed. You've got to have bees doing that pollination. And traditionally, a lot of honeybees used in big orchards, but they found that if they also had native bees in the landscape, that they got more seed, right? So this is great. And people thought, well, the native bees are even better pollinators. And there are good pollinators in that situation. But also what was happening was competition, in that the native bees would get in there, bump off a honeybee, and whereas a honeybee might have spent its whole foraging bout on one flower, if it gets bumped off, it goes to another flower. So suddenly you're getting a lot more movement among the flowers, moving pollen in a much more complicated fashion, a lot more cross-pollination, a lot more seed. So again, we're still discovering all the ways these things interact. But when you get a good flower source, you're bound to get a lot of interested bees and other creatures as well.
Nice. So could you spend a minute to talk about bee collapse?
Yes, I could spend several hours talking about bee collapse, but I'll do it in a minute if I can. So this really sprang to the world's attention in 2006 when commercial beekeepers who know more about keeping honeybee colonies alive than pretty much anyone, because they do it for a living, started noticing massive die-offs along the East Coast in North America initially, and then it spread. Huge die-offs, losing 40, 50, 60% of their hives, some beekeepers losing 80 or 90%, just an apocalypse. And in a mysterious way, the bees would simply abandon the hives. The workers would just not come back. You'd have these empty hives with a sick queen and a few dopey hive bees hanging around, and they would just collapse. So they coined this term, colony collapse disorder, because they didn't quite know what was going on. The good part of that is that it spurred so much research because we are so dependent upon honeybees, particularly for pollination, as our main domestic bee. There was a lot of interest in what was going on. And the research then spread to native bees as well. So it really helped bring the plight of bees to our attention in a way that it might not have if it hadn't been so dramatic. So what's interesting about it, though, is that there is no and has been no single smoking gun identified as the cause of colony collapse. It is much more a combination of things. So bee experts, some of them at least now, are calling it a multiple stress disorder rather than colony collapse, in that you have bees suffering from what some of them call the 4 Ps, the pathogens, diseases that are attacking bees, parasites like the horrible varroa mites that attach themselves to bees and their larvae and suck out their body fluids. You have pesticide use, which is continuing to increase in many of our agricultural landscapes and can be deadly to bees, of course. And then you have something called poor nutrition, which is an interesting one, and one that is something that all of you and any of us can do something about. Poor nutrition meaning a lack of floral resources in the landscape, a lack of flowers. And we see that particularly in industrially farmed landscapes that have changed so much over the past 50, 60, 70 years, as we've shifted from a system of smaller farms to growing a variety of things, to huge farms that tend to grow one thing. And we have gained great efficiency in terms of cheaper food, but done so at the expense of bee habitat. Because if you imagine a landscape that has smaller farms on it with hedgerows separating them, you have farmhouses, and the farmhouses all have little orchards in the backyard and a kitchen garden and some shrubs, and you have shrubs along the roadsides, and there's a lot of habitat there for bees, and you have various crops growing that are blooming at different times. The bees can thrive in a situation like that. But when you become extremely efficient, as we are now, very few farmhouses, because it's large farms covering vast acreage. And if we grow one crop at a time, if we grow mustard, it blooms for 2 or 3 weeks, and that's wonderful bee food, but then there's nothing over all of those acres for the rest of the year. And by eliminating hedgerows and farming what they call road to road, being really efficient again, we've eliminated all those shrubberies in the places that bees could find something to eat in other times rather than the crop bloom. So those monocultures are really a challenging place for bees, and the nutrition, if you will, is terrible for them in those places. So we see now actually some really interesting and innovative work being done where farmers and orchardists are reintroducing hedgerows and some of these more old-fashioned things, cover crops and things, to foster bees year-round, so that they benefit then from the free pollination services that bees have. But it's also something we can all participate in our own backyards by planting bee-friendly, preferably regionally native, but all sorts of other flowers as well that are appropriate for bees. And it's unlike almost any other thing I can think of in terms of conservation, where, by God, if you want to, save killer whales, you're going to work really, really hard for decades, and maybe you're going to see a change. But if you are going to work on the bees in your backyard, you can get something very rare in conservation: instant gratification. Instant gratification meaning, as an example, a year or two back, I decided I needed some more flowers in the little shrubbery in front of my office. I went to the hardware store just to get some catmint, because bees like catmint. It's not native, but I know it's a good nectar source. And I thought, well, I'm going to get this in there for the bees, because I had a gap. And I got back from the hardware store with my catmint, and before I could even get it out of the pot and into the ground, I had 4 species of native bumblebees on the catmint. Instant gratification. So you can do this at a small scale in your yard for a variety of native bees, and you'll see them respond very quickly. Extremely satisfying and very important. The more we do that, the more robust the bees are in terms of what they have to forage on, the better they can resist some of the pathogens, pesticides, even other things that are challenging for them in their environment.
Great. I do just want to acknowledge that it is 7 o'clock, so we kind of are at time. There are a few more questions in the chat though. So if anyone needs to take off, I totally get it. But I just want to ask these few really quickly. Can you speak a little bit about nocturnal pollinators?
Oh, yeah, marvelous. So, and again, this is kind of the undiscovered country for pollination. There's been so much focus on what we see during the daytime that it's only recently, there's some recent work on this out of the United Kingdom where they found that moths were doing far more pollination than anyone was giving them credit for. They're not as efficient, you know, on a per visit scale as a bee in most cases, but there are a lot of moths. There are a lot of moths out there, and in the darkness, some flowers, even that people didn't consider nocturnally pollinated flowers, are being visited by moths seeking nectar. So you do see quite a lot of moth pollination. If you get down into warmer country, the southern parts of the United States and down in particularly in the tropics, you start to see a lot of bat pollination, and there are particular flowers that are beautifully co-evolved with bats for efficient nocturnal pollination done by bats. So certainly a lot of pollination happening after hours, so to speak, and a lot of interesting research effort going into that now.
Nice. What's the evolutionary advantage of a honeybee having a barb stinger that results in them dying after using it?
Ooh, oh, this is such a great question. Yes. So if you ever really want to have a horrible night's sleep, what I recommend highly is get yourself a good microscope and look at a honeybee stinger. You won't sleep a wink. These things, it's not just that it is you know, a sharp pointy thing that contains poison. No, it's more than that. The honeybee stinger is barbed on the edges, but it's actually two sort of scissor blades, if you will, that go like this and work their way in to the flesh, right? And then the barbs prevent the stinger from retracting. So it's really a wicked thing. And it's true that once that thing is stuck in there, even after you brush off the bee, that thing is stuck. But it's not just the stinger that gets stuck. If you look at the end of what's sticking out of your flesh, you're going to see the venom sac itself tears loose from the bee and stays on there with the stinger, right? But it's not just the stinger and the venom sac. It's the stinger and the venom sac and a little nerve ending that's now separate from the bee, but that continues sending signals to the muscles surrounding that sac, so that what happens for a full 30 seconds after you've killed the bee, removed the bee, is that venom sac goes like this, squeezing every drop of venom into the wound. It's diabolical and totally fascinating. So at any rate, it is a mortal wound then to the female bee that has lost her stinger and venom sac and so forth. It's just a horrible abdominal wound. She will die within hours, if not minutes in some cases. And that is a great sacrifice, of course. It only makes sense under certain evolutionary conditions. And it has only evolved, that barb stinger, within the genus Apis, the honeybees, of which there are perhaps 11 species around the world, mostly in Asia. But it only makes sense if you have two things: something you really want to defend, that you really, really, really want to defend, and you have a lot of individuals doing the defense, right? And that if it's just you and you die defending that thing, you haven't accomplished much. So it makes sense for this highly social bee that has very large hive full of honey and full of larvae and full of all of her sisters and full of pollen, all that stuff. That huge investment in the nest is worth defending. So there's a great evolutionary drive to defend it. And because it's a massive social group, they can lose hundreds, even, you know, whatever it takes. They can lose many, many members and still be well off at the end of it. Whereas the vast majority of the world's bees are solitary creatures. they're solitary creatures. They have, it's one female making a nest in a hole in the ground or a hollow twig or what have you. She has 6 or 8 little chambers in there where she's stuffing in pollen and nectar for the single eggs that she's laying upon them. It's a very small affair. And if she is attacked, if she's threatened, it makes far more sense for her to save herself and leave. Or if she has to sting, she'll sting once and go. She doesn't have barbs on her stinger. Her sting is not nearly as potent. It's so it has all to do with the evolutionary context as to why that barb makes sense. And it really only makes sense for those highly, highly social bees.
Cool. That was amazing. This next question, is there a way to clean up leaves and debris on our property without disturbing hibernating bees or bugs?
That's a really good question. I think the best answer to it is to prioritize. When we're talking about habitat for bees and other insects, it's really tempting to think, especially, I mean, just take bees. We think about flowers, right? And we think we're providing habitat flowers, but they're there year round. You know, they are down in the ground year round or in twigs or what have you. So some of that leaf litter is providing a real service, not only for bees, but for butterfly larvae and moth larvae and other insects. So I think the best advice in that regard is to choose the places that you want to keep tidy, but make sure that you leave some places that are a little untidy with leaf litter, because there's going to be a lot of biodiversity in that leaf litter that will really appreciate having that place to live year round. So some places tidy up and leave some places for the bugs, and you'll see more diversity in your yard if you do that. Similarly, with cleaning up your garden space or your shrubberies, there are a lot of things that, like those leftover raspberry canes and so forth. So rather than clean them all up and burn them, clean them up and find a place in the corner of the yard there to tuck them and let them sit, because there's probably stuff living in them or stuff that would like to live in them. And so a bit of clutter is not a bad thing for the diversity of your backyard.
Excellent.
There. Now, you did not think you would attend this lecture and get an ironclad excuse not to clean up your yard, but I just gave you one there. Saved you all kinds of time.
Fantastic. We've got one last question. So Lummi Island has an invasive plant policy, yet as a beekeeper on Lummi Island, Scotch broom and other invasive plants are very important food for my bees. They help keep them fat and happy, as we would say. Can you address this paradox and how to work with it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So you do get, I mean, star thistle honey is delicious, right? So some of these invasive plants, part of the reason they're so successful is they're prolific in their production for pollinators, and they do in landscapes, of course, that, as we've been talking about, are compromised and often offer poor nutrition for bees. There certainly is a role for some of these weeds. Check out Canada thistle. As wretched as it is when it's in a place you don't want it, when it does bloom, you're going to see all sorts of pollinators on it, because it blooms at a time of the year around here when there isn't much else blooming. So again, it's a trick. I mean, it's sort of, making priorities and choosing what you want to manage and what you don't. But I think the bottom line is, if you're going to remove massive nectar sources and pollen sources from the landscape, make sure that you have a plan for what you're going to replace it with, right? Then there may be native species, or there may be less invasive non-native species that can help to replace those things. But it's part of thinking broadly for bees and other pollinators, rather than focusing on getting rid of the weed without thinking what happens next, right? So have a plan, have a longer term plan. If you can replace those things with natives or even regionally native things, you're going to see huge benefits from that to creatures other than bees. And that one of the things we tend not to think about with our invasive species management, or with some of the things we plant, is how these non-native species don't have a lot of the associations with insects that our natives do. They don't have that long evolutionary history. So you might have something that does provide nectar for bees, but there are no moth or caterpillar larvae that will eat its leaves, right? And so if you've got this lot of space taken up by something like a Scotch broom or various other common non-native things that get started and go wide, you're going to have less diversity in that landscape because there aren't a lot of things that co-evolved with them. You might get a few generalist bees that like the nectar, but you're not going to have the specialist bees. You're not going to have the moths. You're not going to have the sawflies and the butterflies and other things. One of my favorite examples of this, and this comes from a fellow named Doug Tallamy, who I think would be a wonderful author for you guys to talk to, but he's written a couple of great books. He's an entomologist, but also a bit of a botanist too, and has gotten really interested in this very question of what native versus non-native plants have to offer. And he used one of many examples, but he used the example of Phragmites, which is a huge grass that is much more common on the East Coast, but Phragmites is considered a terrible invasive, a European version of Phragmites. There's a native North American version that doesn't do this, but the European version spreads and takes over wetlands, just takes it over. But still provides, filtration and services, and it's not just inert. I mean, it's still there doing some wetland function. So there often are questions about, how much time to spend trying to get rid of it. But what's fascinating is even though that plant has been here for centuries, if you look at the diversity of insects on that plant versus Europe, the North American Phragmites, they have only 3% of the insects that they do back in Europe, right? So where you have that long evolutionary history, you have all sorts of bugs and other creatures that have co-evolved to use these plants. But when we take them out of context, even if they're good for certain things, they don't support that wide suite of species that we see with native plants. So anytime you can use something local or regional and work to replace some of these invaders, you're going to see big gains for a whole range of species, some of which you'll never see. Some of these moths, in the middle of the night, you're never going to see it. Maybe you'll see its little inchworm scooting along sometime, little caterpillar. That's it, but it's there, and that's great. So they provide all sorts of functions that we don't even know about at this point. Couldn't even tell you about it. We don't even know, but there they are. If you have the local species for them to feed on.
Wow. Thor, this was amazing. Thank you so much for this presentation. I learned so much. You were such an entertaining speaker and so engaging. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone here had a great time, and I can't thank you enough for being here. So truly, thank you.
I enjoyed it very much. Thanks for all the great questions, and you guys all have a great evening there on Lummi. Bye-bye.